Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Ffinlo Costain. Robert Hindle, the Executive Director of Rural Solutions, has written exclusively for 8.9, reflecting on the recent implementation of the biodiversity net gain policy for England. I spoke to Rob and I started by asking him whether biodiversity net gain is in fact a force for good.
It certainly can be, and I believe it should be. But what is biodiversity net gain? It's a new initiative introduced statutorily by the Environment Act 2021, and the fundamental principle is that all new developments across England must deliver a net uplift of 10% in biodiversity value, and that 10% is calculated in addition to the replace the harm plus 10% uplift.
And is it working?
There's a process element to that answer, and there's an outcome element to that answer. So in process terms, the system is implemented. It's became mandatory for all developments from April 2024, and all planning authorities are obligated to apply the system in their planning permission review and granting process. All applicants are required to demonstrate how they will deliver 10% uplift in their development proposals. So the process is implemented and is beginning to work. And we can perhaps come on to later some of the challenges inherent with it working at various paces and the resources required and the risks associated with that. In terms of outcomes, we have seen some early analysis from Oxford University that suggests that the use of habitat creation as partly a proxy for, but also a means of driving biodiversity gain is valid. And we've seen a reasonably broad experience of the significant recovery of nature where new habitats are introduced and where habitats are allowed to restore and recover.
I wonder whether you could help me with an illustration, Rob. If we're talking about a new development of, say, a dozen houses on the edge of a village, building on a field with hedgerows and a bit of woodland, there's a degree to which I can visualize BNG delivery off-site, recreating habitat in adjacent areas or indeed further afield. But how do you deliver that net gain on the site itself?
The first approach is to avoid harm. And there's nothing about biodiversity net gain that removes the existing protections within the planning system for habitat and nature and landscape. So the overarching principle of first avoid harm. If you can't avoid, minimize. If you can't minimize, mitigate, and only after you've tried all three do you compensate. You would carry that principle onto the site, and you would say, well, let's understand where the richer habitats are on the site, and let's avoid damage and destruction and impact on those. Clearly, some damage is going to be inevitable because you're replacing natural habitat with built infrastructure. So you would, first of all, you'd try and design the scheme in a way that avoided and minimized harm as best you could. So you would avoid the woodland, and if you had an element of the site that was richer in habitat and an element of the site that was poorer in habitat, you seek to focus on the poorer area for your development. You would then need to understand what the habitat was that the development was replacing, and you'd need to replace it off-site, and you'd need to either replace more of the same, so a minimum of 10% more of the same, or you could choose to replace with a richer habitat. And that would potentially deliver your 10% uplift through delivering a richer habitat on a similar or perhaps even smaller area. So, for example, if in the next door field there was a wet area that was a bit marshy, that you might decide that you could create a pond and a sort of a wetland space. You might be able to deliver your 10% uplift. In fact, you might well be able to deliver significantly more than a 10% uplift by creating a new wetland habitat in the adjacent field, which would then deliver on the biodiversity net gain requirement for the 8 or 10 houses on the improved or semi-improved grassland in the next door field.
So how does BNG fit alongside other existing markets for natural capital in England?
As a market, it is it's one of two regulatory driven markets currently, if we think of regulatory as within the planning system. So the other is nutrient neutrality, which people will probably have heard about. And as a market, it is a no option. The buyer has to engage in this market in some way to deliver to get their planning permission, unless, of course, they can meet the requirements on their own site. The other markets for natural capital goods you could probably consider would be the carbon codes, the woodland carbon code and the peatland carbon code, which are a very different thing. And then beyond that, we have a very nascent emerging market for generally a voluntary investment in habitat creation for nature recovery by a third party organization with a land manager. And that third party organization is very often either a corporation or an institution of some kind. That's very early stage. There are very few of those deals around, and there's no regulatory framework for those deals to sit within or be driven by currently.
Now, you mentioned nutrient neutrality there, and the Conservative manifesto says that the party would abolish nutrient neutrality rules and instead require developers to pay a one-off mitigation fee. Is that a positive step?
I think it depends what becomes of the money. If the money's invested in reducing nutrient loading in the catchment, then it may be a shortcut and it may deliver more effective outcomes from a strategic perspective. If the money disappears into a general fund, then no, it's not a positive step in my view.
So coming back to BNG, could biodiversity net gain be used to justify development on irreplaceable habitats such as species-rich grassland or ancient forests?
Absolutely not. The biodiversity net gain regulations specifically exclude irreplaceable habitats from the compensatory part of the process, and they revert to the existing heavy protections within the planning system. The reliance on those protections. So you cannot compensate for loss of an irreplaceable habitat through the biodiversity net gain mechanism. What you can do, though, is you can enhance irreplaceable habitats and get the benefit of those enhancements as a biodiversity net gain.
And where are we currently in terms of the capacity to deliver biodiversity net gain? Are all the planning authorities as prepared as each other?
The readiness, the preparedness of planning authorities ranges enormously across the country. And I think a lot of the planning authorities that we deal with and a lot of planning authorities that we speak to have serious concerns about their ability to respond effectively to the requirements that mandatory biodiversity net gain has placed upon them swiftly. And they're very concerned about the implications that will have for their ability to effectively work through the development management process. There are also, of course, are implications for their policy process. They've got to review existing policy and make sure it now it aligns with the new requirements. And then there is also an increased load on them in terms of monitoring and potentially enforcement, which is something that they've not been expected to deal with in this area before.
Now, you said that the delivery of more, bigger, better joined up spaces for nature requires a more proactive and more strategic approach. What do you mean by that?
A coming together of thinking around around how to make use of the money that will flow through biodiversity net gain to deliver nature recovery in the best, most targeted, strategic way within a local authority territory. So, and if you think of either end of the spectrum, at the one end is the Lawtonian principles of bigger, better, joined up, connected spaces for wildlife, with habitats that are natural and complementary to one another. And as we can see from landscape the government's landscape recovery initiatives, scale, aggregation, connectivity delivers value and delivers value add. At the other end of the BNG spectrum is a series of very small contributions to habitat creation and maintenance on a pepper pot of sites that are sporadically generated through a demand for development that is completely unconnected with a strategic approach to delivering nature recovery within the same territory. So in order to achieve a strategic approach, the local authority needs to be willing to take a lead, and it needs to be willing to work with other partners who understand what strategic nature recovery would look like in that territory, and that partnership exists through the local nature recovery partnerships. And so there is an opportunity to take a spatially targeted approach and also a targeted approach to the type of habitat that would be created and through application of BNG monies, and the way that habitat would be managed alongside other habitat being managed for nature recovery reasons, perhaps through existing organisations and existing agreements.
And just finally, Rob, in their manifesto, the Lib Dems say that they want to deliver not just 10%, but 100% BNG uplift for large-scale developments. Is that achievable?
Anything is achievable off-site, provided you can get access to the land. But so anything is achievable. I think there'll be a fundamental question about the implications that has for the viability of the scheme, depending on the costs associated with delivering the biodiversity net gain uplift. I think we will expect to see some developers seek to make viability arguments around a 10% requirement, in particularly in specific areas. But the fundamental answer is yes, if the land is available and the land managers are willing, then any scale of uplift is achievable off-site.
That was Robert Hindle from Rural Solutions, and the Labour Party manifesto had yet to be launched when this interview was recorded. More news on our website 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.